Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
When I was 16, I loved playing the violin. I didn't want to be anything, I just loved playing the violin, I loved playing the piano.
And while you were living in South London?
I was living in sort of Kilburn, Willesden way, but I was having all my lessons in Highgate. I used to go to Highgate and I met a lot of wonderful Jewish people. I met the person who was incredibly influential was the niece of Stefan Zweig, and his niece, who's now 90, her incredible cultured people, although she's a professor of epidemiology. And so with her children, I used to play music. This is in my teens. And then I tried to get into the Royal Academy of Music, which means you want to become a performer. And I got into the Royal Academy of Music to do piano and violin. And then somebody in the London Philharmonic Orchestra called LPO, called Ken King, who had played his violin, he was an Australian, who'd played his violin in the LPO for years and years and years. And he said to me, in age 17, he said, Wasfi, if you go to the Royal Academy of Music, you kind of have one option to become a player, yeah? If you go to Oxford, you'll have many, many options will open themselves up to you. And he said it'll change your life. So I did my Oxford entrance exam and I got into Oxford and I went to Oxford and I carried on playing my violin. And it does actually change your life because suddenly you see a much, much, much bigger world and you meet people who are doing many different subjects. And so that, for example, the historian I met had a huge influence on what I would read and what I became interested in.
But you were also a conductor, no?
Later on, not till much later. So then I went to did my Oxford stuff, and then we didn't have any money, so I had to get a job, and my family didn't have any money, and I became a computer programmer. Yes, this was in the days when the computers that I was programming were bigger than this house. In the 1980s.
Right.
So it's before microcomputers.
But why you went to computer?
Because I was good at maths. And I like doing, programming computers is like doing a puzzle. Except for you do your puzzle, you see whether the program's working, and if it's wrong, you have to find the mistake. And as soon as the puzzle's correct, you go on to the next puzzle.
And then you went back to music again?
And then I went back to music. When I was 30, I had this Damascene moment when I thought, my God, I'm 30, I'm so old. If I'm 80 and I haven't, what would I regret if I look back at my life? I remember when I was 30 thinking that, if I'm 80 and I go backwards, what will I think I haven't done? And I knew that I would regret not having done more with my music.
And so what did you do?
So I kind of thought, well, what I have always really wanted to do is conduct, but I didn't think I could because I was a woman. So I had conducting lessons and I started doing quite a lot of conducting. And that was from about the age of 30 onwards. And there was a time when I set up a little business doing private computer consultancy, and I had some quite big clients. But I think the important thing, Alain, is that in my mid-20s, I bought a house, because you could buy a house for nothing then. So I'm 63, so I'm talking about, by 1985, I bought a small house in Kentish Town, which is near Camden Town, which isn't as nice as this, but it's a cul-de-sac. And when I wanted a bigger house, I'd just buy the house next door, because they cost nothing. So I now live in 3 houses with lots and lots of space, which I like. It's good for the piano. So I bought this house and I thought, I'm not particularly interested in money. I don't want to get any richer. And that's why I felt I should look at what I want to do.
And now around 1987 you created your Pimlico opera. What was Pimlico opera?
Because I was lodging with some very kind people in Pimlico in Cambridge Street. And I created this tiny opera company, and the first performance we ever did was in St Luke's, Sydney Street, not very far from here.
What did you do? You created an orchestra? Or?
I created an orchestra, I put on a little production. I'm sure it was terrible. I don't think it was terrible because the guy who was singing Figaro, he's called Christoforos Stamboglis, he sings at Glyndebourne. And the woman who was singing the Countess, La Contessa in Figaro. She has a big career as well. You know, some of the others don't have big careers.
And that was just the beginning, right?
It was the beginning.
And you were conducting the Pimlico opera.
Yeah, Les Nozze di Figaro.
And why then you became famous in a way, or I mean, this orchestra became bigger and bigger, and you directed in hospital, prisons.
So the story of this is, so I had my little company, and I'd go to the National Trust and do a nice opera for them in the garden or in a tent, yeah? So I was doing, and I did it for, you know, for banks where they just paid us enough so that I could make the whole thing work. No one was trying to get rich. And then I think it was in about 1988 or 1989, it just struck me that I was doing all these operas and all these people were enjoying it, and I thought, well, people in prison might enjoy opera. And I'd been to school behind, you know, this prison in Shepherd's Bush called Wormwood Scrubs. Yeah. I'd been to a grammar school just behind it, so Wormwood Scrubs was very familiar to me, and I wrote the governor a letter saying I wanted to come and do an opera there for the prisoners. And he said yes, and so I took a little orchestra. I had lights and we had costumes. And The Marriage of Figaro, as you know, is a very, very long opera, 4 hours, lots of recitative.
Yeah, where did you do it?
In the chapel at Wormwood Scrubs. I don't know if you know, massive 19th century chapel, which has Ivor Novello's piano in it, because he was in Wormwood Scrubs as a conscientious objector. So I did this production of Figaro, and all the prisoners were there, and it was the same time that there'd been a riot in Strangeways prison in Manchester. From that you can figure out what the year is, I can't remember. At the end of the performance, which had been going on for 4 hours, to a load of people who, many people in prison can't even read, let alone understand Italian, but they could kind of tell what was going on, and they could also tell that it was something good. This is what was extraordinary. And they got to the end, and they all leapt to their feet. And all the guards around the side, they thought this was going to be another riot. So they kind of got very agitated. But then the prisoners sat down and they filed out in single file. So that was the first. And then I did a few other things like that. And then of course, the next thing to do is to try and do a production with the prisoners in it.
Who was paying for the production?
I raised the money. We are a charity.
And the prisoners liked it?
The prisoners liked it when we performed to them, and then we put on a show where they were the main performers.
So you had to teach them to sing?
Yeah, we had to teach them everything. By working with them rather than just doing a performance, I thought that if you worked with them for a longer period, so you do 4 weeks of rehearsal or a term of rehearsals or whatever, they'd actually engage with what they're doing consistently over weeks and talk to their families about it, and then I said their families could come to the production, and so I did it.
What kind of people prisoners are? In which conditions do they live?
In Wormwood Scrubs, it was 4 wings, and the wing I was dealing with was only a wing of what they call lifers. And lifers are mainly people who don't necessarily spend their life in prison, but if you've killed someone, you get a life sentence.
So you were with people who had life sentence. And how did you feel with them?
I feel no different from how I feel with you. Ultimately, Alain, we're kind of all the same. And so
we don't kill people, we don't all kill people.
I think probably I've got it in me. I think if my life had gone a different way, I probably could have killed someone. A very important element of this is that there are 85,000 people in prison in Britain today, and about 2,000 of them are probably serving life sentences. And of that group...
Why did you choose the life sentence?
I didn't. I just wrote to the prison. The governor, he wanted us to do this project with that wing. And he said, they're lifers. And he said, because they're lifers, they're actually having to deal with the idea of being in prison probably for 10 years. And so they're people who might benefit the most from it. Because they're not going to come out next week. They've got to deal with, I'm going to be in prison probably for 10 years or more. Some of them are sentenced and some of them aren't sentenced. There was, I have
And how do you pick them up as singers?
We don't audition them. We walk around the wing and we still do it this way. We say we're doing a play, because if you say we're doing an opera, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. I say we're doing a play with singing in it. If you want to be in it, put your name down, and then this is how it'll all work. Sometimes I say to a prisoner, tell me, who likes showing off on the wing? And they'll say, oh, that guy likes showing off. Sing to us. interestingly, you get this bunch of people together and they find their own
the
level.
prison is only men and only women, or it's mixed?
In Britain, as I said, there are 85,000 people in prison. There are no joint prisons, but there are only 13 prisons for women. The women's prison population is very small. There are only about 5,000 women.
But in opera you have men and women.
Yeah, so we put professional parts. So if I'm in a men's prison, I have to engage
find professional women.
And when I'm in a woman's prison, which is where I am now, I have to employ some professional men.
And how do the professional singers, man or woman, interact with assassins?
When we engage them for the project, we talk to them about the project and what the project's about. And when you say assassins, I think an assassin and someone who's killed someone are different things. Stephen Sondheim did write a musical called Assassins, which is about people who are assassinating a random person, like the President of the United States. As I said, there are 2,000 people, I didn't finish off saying this, but there are 2,000 people in prison in Britain today who are serving life sentences, probably some more. Most of them kill someone they know, a friend or a wife or whatever. I'm not saying it's a good thing to kill someone you know. There are very few who just go around killing random people. There's a handful of them, and they're the nutters. They're the people who will never ever come out of prison.
You didn't have that kind of people among your singers?
No, because these are people who need, so there are, or if you commit a particularly hideous crime, when they get tried, they don't get given a life sentence, they get given a full life sentence, which means they will serve the rest of their life has to be away from society, because they are a public danger.
These people who worked with you feel guilty, about what they did, or they don't like to talk about it?
I never engage them in conversations. They often do talk about it or want to talk about it. So when you're serving a life sentence, you get to a stage in they call it your career, where you will be assessed for release. And an essential part when your assessment for release is that you have shown remorse. If you just go, it was fine, I killed my husband, but he deserved it, you'll never get out of prison. You have to have been seen to have considered in some depth what you did, the implications of what you did. This causes a problem for some people, because if they didn't do it, they can't show remorse. And I know one particular woman prisoner who's in prison, who's been in prison a long time. I first met her in prison in 2010, and she's in prison for killing her husband, and she swears blind that she didn't do it. I find myself thinking, why don't you just say you did it? Because you'd be out by now. She would be out by now. But she says, I did not do it. So when you say, do they show, they have to show remorse, and they have to show they've thought about why they did it, and the prison authorities.
And how are the conditions of the prisoners?
Different in different prisons. I think one of the great problems with prisons today is that a prison is meant to be making a person into a useful member of society. Yeah, I always say I want them to become taxpayers. I want them to leave prison, get a job, and contribute to society through their taxes. That's what I say in a lot of interviews. But in order for that to happen, they need a lot of input, they need education. Half the prison population has a reading age of less than an 11-year-old. I meet many people in prison who can't read. So there's a huge problem of literacy. You can't really have a job if you can't read, can you? I mean, how many jobs are there if you can't read at all? So prison conditions, the most important thing is that they receive education and they're unlocked. This whole thing about how many hours they spend unlocked is a key indicator on the likelihood of a prisoner becoming a useful member of society, because prison numbers go up and up and up and up.
And there are many in one cell, or?
They're many in twos.
And there's a lot of crime inside the prison? Inside
the prison there's a lot of drug dealing, but it's not all from the prisoners. Drugs get into prison. How do you think the drugs get into prison? It's been proved. So, a lot of the drugs come into prison through the staff. You're not meant to have mobile phones, and mobile phones come into prison. See, running prisons is a very, very difficult thing.
And what is your relationship with this universe? I mean, you have been working now for 20 years with them, right?
30.
30. So this is very much your environment, right?
Well, I had put on these massive operas. And I built
some of
theatre.
these people came out of prison.
Yeah.
And are they still into the music and the singing or not? Some of them became singers or...
No, I don't do it because I want them to become singers. But you know, you're not a singer, but music speaks to you. So as long as music continues to speak to them, that's why I did it.
But then no one of them wanted to...
Yes, I've actually had some that ended up in the West End. I've had one guy who's been in quite a lot of shows in the West End. Who was an exceptional talent. Oddly, only 2 days ago, one of the lifers sent a message through the office, sent a message to my office, and I actually want you to quote the message was, let me just find my handbag because it's on my phone. Just to say thank you. I am out now. I took part in Earlstoke Les Miserables as the leader of the revolution, Enjolras. As a lifer, you gave me hope and acceptance. Thank you. I worked with him in 2012 or 2011. But it's sweet because he's come out, he's remembered this, and he's bothered to look up how to get in touch with the organisation.
But prisoners, lifers, when they come out, they are accepted by the society, or they have problems when they say they want to rent a flat, or they say, you know, how is the society vis-a-vis people who come out of prison?
So there is a very vulnerable time, even if you're not a lifer. If you come out of prison, it is for precisely that reason. It's a very vulnerable moment, and there are many charities, and it ought to be the government, but it's not the government, who particularly meet the prisoner at the gate and try and make sure they're in accommodation, that they're in touch with the right people who might support them, and not in touch with the people so they might go back to their heroin addiction or whatever. So this is now this guy, because he spent so long in prison, there's no way they would have released him into society, making sure he's got accommodation and probably making sure he's got some kind of job. And I replied to him through the office and said, that's great to hear from you, what are you up to? And no doubt he'll tell me that he's managing to do this. And
they are of any age, all ages? Some are younger, or no, there's no... And there are more men or women?
Well, in the men's prisons, you know, I meet the men, but there are more men who kill than women. So there are so few women in prisons because one of the reasons society doesn't want to put women into prison is because their children get put into care. And the way it works is if you're in care, of all the people in care, I think a third of them end up in prison. So through no fault of their own, they've ended up without any kind of family support. So they don't want to put the woman in prison because the children go into care, and then it increases the likelihood.
And what do they do?
There's many, probation, there's many supervision methods of dealing with it.
How do they kill normally? With a knife?
I do know. Well, possessing a firearm in itself is an offence. So nobody wants to... Possessing a gun, even if you don't use it, is an offence. I'm only talking about England. Whereas possessing a knife isn't an offence. So that in itself probably answers your question. The men, I've met lots of men who've used guns. But
what is normally the principal cause of murder?
A lot of men seem to just have a fight about anything. I think the problem with men is they've got too much testosterone. They get angry. Anger. The women, the governor of the prison in Surrey where we're working now, the governor himself says 65%, they've done a kind of assessment, many of the women in prison have been abused. I mean, I knew one woman who, and often they kill in self-defence, but you still killed someone, you're still going to go to prison. So each story is different, and each story is kind of a waste of a life. It's a waste of the person who died, and it's a waste of the person who did the killing. There are 300 people at a time in the auditorium. We kind of create an auditorium, and a handful of them will be related to somebody in the show. So what we do is at the end of the performance, the most security-wise, the most tricky moment for us is the public leaving the prison and making sure no prisoners leave the prison. And then at the end of the performance, the families can then talk to their member of, their son or whatever, who's been in the show, and they often say they're very proud. And I find that the most heartbreaking. A mother who's my age and her son's just been in the show, and the family's unbelievably grateful.
How many shows you do?
We do about 8, and then we only do it for one chunk of the year. It's coming up in March, the next chunk. So we build a massive set. We have a live orchestra. It's like going to the West End. So, it's such effort to create the auditorium.
And you're still conducting?
I haven't conducted for a long time because, there are lots of people who want to conduct, and there are lots of people who conduct, but I feel that my skill is probably putting the whole thing together and making sure there's enough money.
Is opera very popular in this country?
In this country? Well, there's a lot of opera put on and people go to it. So, I'd say by and large, of course, I don't think the British are as inherently cultured as the French or Germans. They don't have this great, or the Italians. When I go to the opera in Rome, you just see people of all different ages, and that's just what they do. They all go to the opera. So here it's a bit more of a kind of older people tend to go, and yeah.
And you're pleased with this kind of job?
No one's ever asked me that before. It's a job. Well, I think it's
You create operas in prisons, right? But you could go to Covent Garden also.
So I built a massive opera house where I put on some very big, very, very big operas.
And it is out of your charity that you...
All done from the charity.
This opera is your main thing?
Yeah.
So prison is a...
So we also do work in prisons, and we do a lot of work in primary schools to children less than aged, up to the age of 11.
And how do children react to opera?
It's not opera, this is to do with singing. Many schools in Britain don't have any music at all. No music. So many primary schools have no music. So we find the schools that have no music, and we give them a teacher who will give a half-hour singing class every week of the year. So suddenly you create music in a school that had no music. But it's just a singing class, and they learn songs, and they give a concert, and they might do one piece of opera. But it's just music.
In your opera house you do proper opera?
But sometimes I do a musical. I did Porgy and Bess, which I don't know, is an opera. This year one of my pieces is Meet Me in St. Louis, which is a musical.
And how many people come to your...
During my season, which lasts about 6 or 7 weeks, 15,000. The whole idea of opera in the country, which was of course invented by Glyndebourne, the whole idea is that you enjoy the gardens.
So it's seasonal?
Yeah, in May the weather's really bad, and in June it's quite good, and in July it's quite good, and then many people go away for the whole of August. So that's why that's our window. We do some other bits and pieces in the winter, but the core business, the core of the charity is the opera in the summer, this 6 weeks.
And you have your own orchestra, or you invite other...
So we use the Orchestra of English National Opera, because they don't perform at that time of year, and we use the BBC Concert Orchestra. And what I try to do is I try to have one piece of mainstream repertoire. So if you've never been to the opera before and you think, oh, I'm going to try the opera because I like the look of the gardens and it sounds like an amazing event, something like Bohème or Tosca, something that a title that people recognise, then I'll do one piece that's completely insane, that people will think, why the ever is she doing that? And then my 2 pieces are kind of in the middle. So this year, my obvious piece is Bohème. The really insane piece is a new opera, it's a world premiere, about the death of Alexander Litvinenko, who was the man who was poisoned with polonium-210, the Russian. And then I've got La Gioconda. Do you know Gioconda? By Ponchielli, but I've got this very famous Maltese tenor called Joseph Calère taking the principal part, Enzo. So we're doing it because he said he wanted to do it. And then, what's our other piece? Oh, we're doing a musical, Meet Me in St. Louis. What we did this summer, we did Hansel and Gretel, we did Porgy and Bess, and we did Don Carlo, Verdi. And then Joyce Di Donato came to sing one concert for us, which is very nice. And then Simon Keenlyside, who's a baritone who does stuff at the Royal Opera House, he came for an evening, but he did jazz, because he does this jazz thing in Vienna, and he does it in Paris. And I I think people come and they have to have an amazing time. They have to see beautiful gardens. It's not, and then they have a long dinner interval. I was in Hampshire, and there's no doubt about it, you know, because of the conurbation of London and the density of the population here, we've benefited from moving closer to London.
What are you, an impresario now? An opera or musical impresario?
I don't call myself an impresario, but I've started it, and I think I like working, I enjoy working, and I regard this being my job to being an incredible privilege. You know, culture, I mean, you know, culture, it changes people, by feeling different things, you learn about yourself a bit more. So, you know, culture is very important.
But don't you regret not to be a conductor anymore or a performer?
No, because I think if I'd carried on conducting, well, I still have a big say about the operas. I choose the operas, I'm involved in casting, so I listen to a lot of opera, I go to the opera, I employ very good conductors. There's a whole music staff of people, and they can focus on that, and I can focus on the big picture.
Your religious side, I mean, the fact that you became a Catholic because of music, or music helped you to, you're still very involved in that, still very religious?
No, I wouldn't describe myself as very religious, but now that I'm 63, I think the way religion speaks to, you know, it's the idea is that there's something in the world beyond the world that I see. And I think that's what culture does as well. You know, what you feel demonstrates to you, like music demonstrates to you, a world beyond the world that you can see. So they're kind of related. I don't go to church every Sunday, but I do admit that when I was going through the trauma of building this opera house in super quick time, and I had a lot going on and I was finding things very, very difficult, I did go and sit in my local Catholic church, and I found it very peaceful there. And I very much, yeah. And
what is your community of Indian Muslims think about you?
I've never had any relations here. I don't know. I'm not part of an Indian community. I never have. We came here in the 1950s. I've been to India many times, but I've never particularly wanted to just absorb people because they happen to have some blood in common with me. So
do you feel Indian? I mean,
I do. You know, the first time I went to India in 1991, when the plane touched down and I saw all these people working amazingly hard, I thought, my God, these are my people. Because, you know, this idea of hard work, you know, even the man who sells 3 oranges, he makes sure his 3 oranges are beautifully presented. You know, he's got nothing, and tomorrow he might be able to sell 4 oranges. And when I saw how hard they worked and how they celebrate work as a, you know, work.
You never thought about doing opera in India?
People have talked to me about it. I've got enough on my plate. People have talked to me about it. You know, I have some Indian members, and they say, "Oh, why don't you do an opera in Bombay?" But you know, doing opera in foreign countries, do you take the orchestra with you? Do you rehearse a new orchestra out there? Do I take the set with me? Do I get the set rebuilt? It would completely engulf the company. So you know, the most important thing is that this is successful and that we do good things. So I've thought of lots of things, and I just go, you know, it's a bridge too far.
And the prison work is still going on, and is it very difficult to work in a prison?
There are difficult logistics. There's a group of people who do this. I don't actually run the prison project anymore. Because the company has been doing it for so long. When we go to the prison, somebody from the security department might say, and then this is awful, what if this happens? And then Helen, who runs the project, she goes, well, what we always do is we do this, and then we do it like that, and then we do it like that. So that's why it can never go wrong. We've been to Ireland, we've been to Wiltshire, we've been to Hampshire, we've been all over the place. The culture of a prison is driven by the governor. So the main man who's running it, obviously, you know, his beliefs about what the prison's meant to be achieving.
And they're different?
you know, they're different human beings, so they're nuanced differently, aren't they? You know, they have, officially, they're a group of, you know, this is what they have to do, but how they will achieve that will vary from prison to prison.
How are the conditions of prisoners?
Yeah.
Do they have good food? Are they taken care in a proper way?
Yeah.
Or
So the prison's cleaned by the prisoners. The prisoners are the cleaners. So they want to live in clean circumstances, so the prison's clean. Some of the older, I won't go into some of the older prisons, the food is cooked by the prisoners. So the prisoners, there are now good people guiding how food in prison can be better. It doesn't have to cost anymore. So it's not shipped in, the prisoners actually cook it. They have kitchens where the prisoners work. So the food, again, because they're cooking for their own people, there's a real motive to be serving good food. And then, you know, their mental health. I think prisons work very, very hard to deal with these things. You know, if you come in hugely addicted to heroin, you'll be given whatever drug is used to get you off your heroin, and, you know, you'll be monitored about whether, and then at some point the prisoner says, okay, I'm going to come off that drug and I'll have to do cold turkey for a week, but I'll do it. And quite often during our project, we have prisoners who say they're going to do they'll come off all their drugs. They know they'll feel terrible for a number of weeks, but because they're doing the project, they feel that'll get them through that bit. So I've known hundreds of prisoners. And, you know, I must admit, every time I go into prison, I always say I learn something. So each prisoner has a different sort of story to tell, and some are more tragic than others. I always learn something. And you know, when I said to you at the beginning, we could all have done it. Well, maybe you couldn't have done it, but I do think but for the grace of God, it could have, you know, we're just very lucky. I feel very lucky I've been born into this set of circumstances.
These people come from very disadvantaged, no?
This is terrible. This is what's so terrible. Our prisons are full of people, you know, people who can't read. Do you know people who can't read? Or can all your friends read?
And they are a majority of British people, or?
Whole mixture. In fact, over the years, there's a disproportionate, this is one of the big prison statistics, is that it's a disproportionate, compared to if you take a percentage, if we divided up society and said prisons are going to be full of a proportionate number of white people, brown people and black people, but it doesn't work like that. There's a disproportionate number of black people. And now there's more and more, I've noticed over the years, Asians, because of the whole sort of this violent jihadi ethos that's spread amongst young people. The whole Muslim jihad and ISIS and all this lark, which, you know, many Muslims would say it's not actually Islam that they're preaching, some kind of hatred. Big prison population. I've got one strand, which is just about people who've committed murder, who are lifers. Then I've got all the rest of the prisoners. So mainly I have to talk about all the rest of the prisoners. I must admit, whenever I've been to prisons, my prison down in Wiltshire was about people serving very long sentences. That probably reflected society more than prisons at large. Yeah, the greater part of the prison population. So remember, 85,000 people in prison, and 2,000-3,000 are serving life sentences.
And many of these people commit suicide, or?
I've never come across a suicide in prison, but when you say many people, of the 85,000 people, you know, many of them don't commit suicide. I think, but any suicide in prison, as soon as you put someone in prison, the system should, they put them in this situation, the system has to look after them. But there are suicides in prison. And it's, they take it very seriously, and it shouldn't happen.
But for instance, these people who don't read, they teach them how to read?
Yes. In fact, often another prisoner will teach them how to read. Usually on a wing in the prison, so they divide up the prison into sections, they call them wings. On a wing, they usually have a few prisoners who will help the new prisoners who just arrive, who'll be sometimes they're totally freaked out. If you're going into prison for the first time, it's pretty frightening. It's just terrifying because you're out of you're no longer, you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't have access to any information.
They don't watch television.
Well, they do watch television, but it's still frightening because you have no control over your own destiny. Court is going to decide what happens to you next, and people within the prison are going to decide what happens to you next. And that's what's terrifying. And, often they're worried about what's happening to the people, they've let down their family. They realise they've let down their family. I think, Alain, if you came into a prison and stood on the wing when you saw new prisoners come in, I think you'd cry.
And then they get used.
Some of them never get. It becomes normal. Well, for many people, when they say people are institutionalised, this means they find it easier being in the institution than out of the institution. And there was one prisoner who, very talented, came off his drugs, good and clean, and he came out and we tried to help him. We gave him a job. We often employ ex-prisoners and just try and help them on their way. We've employed many ex-prisoners. And this guy, he said he was about 40 years old. He said, I've been in prison 40 times. Lots of short sentences. And he says, in the winter, big drug user, so homeless. So in the winter, when it gets a bit cold, commit a crime, get put in prison. This is what he used to say. Laundry arrives, because the prisoners do go on. He said he gets all his laundry. It's like living in a sort of low-quality hotel. So that's what being institutionalised is, and that's the problem, which is why I say I'm trying to make them into taxpayers.
What a strange universe, right?
And what a strange universe that one person can be worth, one human being can be worth, some people get paid £8 million a year or £20 million a year, and another human being, society can't even figure out a way of making him into a useful member of society. He can't even be paid £2 a day. How can two human beings be so different? The universe is an extraordinary place.
And what do they like most? Freedom?
Well, they're all different. What do they like? I went to Brixton about a few months ago because somebody in my office had said, oh, Wasfi, what we need to do is we need to be able to tell people what happened to the prisoners that you worked with in 1990. And I thought of the name of one funny guy who I was pretty sure he'd be out by now. And I Googled him and I found that he'd become a kind of poet and that he was a bit of, he was obviously making something of his life down in Brixton, though he has been in and out of prison. And so I went down to have dinner with him. And Errol must be in his 50s, very intelligent, very badly educated, but he's kind of educated himself and writes this performance poetry, and he's got a bit of a following. So this guy likes poetry. I mean, he likes words. This guy likes words.
And how many like music?
Well, many people like music. Music gets you. When they sing together, it's a bit like, at the football, 70,000 people sing at Arsenal. And it kind of moves them all to move. So music at some level, it does, most people it touches.
And you are unique in your profession in England? In this performing in prison?
This prison thing, I don't think anyone else does it quite like this. There are many charities working in prisons doing different things. And one of the things we say is we do this huge project, which is very disruptive to the prison. And then once we've gone, the staff of the prison have realised that these projects are good, and then they allow other charities to come in and do other work. So it's often a catalyst for other similar projects, but not on that scale.
But the opera you do in Surrey is not a charity.
It is a charity. Well, the Royal Opera House is a charity. Cameron Mackintosh isn't a charity. People
give money to your organisation for one thing or the other, or it's one thing and it goes.
Sometimes they do both, and sometimes they give some money to the operas because they want.
And how do you get your money?
I have to do lots of fundraising, endlessly.
And who are the people who give you the funds?
Obviously, people who like opera, and people who believe in me, and people who believe in the project, and people who've seen what we've done, and some people who don't particularly like opera, but they can see that I've created a lot of employment.
How many people work with you?
Well, in the office in Hampshire, 14 people work all the time, 16, 14. During the festival, if you count the chorus, the orchestra, a load of people backstage, the restaurant staff, the car park boys, you're talking about 400 people. So we go from an organisation of 14 to an organisation of 400. So there's a lot of scope for things going wrong.
So what would you say about yourself? Who are you now? An organizer, an impresario? You run a charity? How would you describe your activity?
Well, when I have to write it on a form going into a new country, it says profession, I say theatre producer. I never say opera producer because then they start talking to me. So I just say theatre producer. And they often say, what does it mean? For example, if I go to Morocco, I have to do that. And it just says, I put on operas. That's all I do. And all I do is employ people. That's what I say. I just employ people. A charity in England is run by a set of trustees who are really responsible for the charitable funds. So there's a chairman who's a very big, important businessman. There are charity trustees. There are about 10 of them. You know, one of them's a director at Saatchi's, another one's the head of insolvency at Linklaters. You know, some big, heavy-duty city people, and I'm just called the chief executive. So in effect, I work for them. The opera, the one that does the big operas, that started in 1998. But then we moved in 2017. I had to move because my lease was terminated. We had a lease, and it was meant to be a particular length, and then it was cut short. So we didn't have the right to renew. So my lease was cut short. So my trustees, who are my employers, they said, Wasfi, we've got three choices. That we close the charity, we give the charity to the people who terminated our lease, because they obviously wanted the charity very much, because we had a lot of cash. And the third choice is that you find a new venue. So I went and found a new venue. Not me.
And how long did it take to build it?
Well, it took me 1 year to get planning permission. Round London in about the 1950s, I think, in order to stop London sprawling, it was deemed there would be a belt of green, and no one was allowed to build in it. No one is allowed to build anything. And the trouble is, this place that we wanted to build an opera house in was in Greenbelt. And it's a 5-storey building. You can't even build a garage in Greenbelt. So I had to get permission to do that, and that took me 1 year.
Where is your heart?
Where's my heart? I think the greatest gift of my life is playing a Mozart string quartet. It's amazing to be able to sit with, you know, all we've got is a bit of wood, and so that when you say where's my heart, so I love music. I really love music, and I love all kinds of music. And now that I'm 63, I know lots of different kinds of music. I know symphonic repertoire and chamber music and opera. And then the other thing I've grown to love more, but only in the last 10 years, I've developed I love the ancient world. So I love, you know, there's so much to learn about the Romans, and I've just come back from the Peloponnese, and I went to south of Olympia. There's a temple yet another temple of Apollo at 1,000 metres above sea level. And it's quite a difficult drive up there. And the Bassi frieze that was in there, of course, is in the British Museum.
I know.
It's not as fine as the Parthenon frieze. And it's, you know, Amazon's slugging it out with the... But of course, the tragedy of the Parthenon frieze is it's actually displayed the wrong way round anyway. Because you really need to stand on the corner and see the procession going around the building. And it's because you're inside the room. I don't think people really make sense of it.
So at the end of the day, we can say about Wasfi that you have given your life to music, playing and then directing, and then organizing, and then being now the head of this big foundation. We can say has two wings, no? One is the opera house in the summer, and the other one is prisons in the winter, right?
Yeah.
This is more or less. It's very interesting, and I think it's very interesting to bring music into prisons.
The more people who go into prisons. See, one of the problems with prisons in Britain is that no government feels compelled to do anything about it. There was a point when David Cameron did speak very publicly about doing some very sensible things, and as soon as he'd done it, he left. So no government feels compelled to really do anything about it because it's not a vote winner. And so, for example, just now, all this rhetoric about 10,000 taser guns, it's all about being tough on crime. It isn't actually solving the problem. So the Daily Mail has all this stuff about how people, you know, most people would think that the people in prison are all murderers. And I often say at dinner parties when people are very kind of anti-prison reform or whatever, I say, well, tell me I'm going to tell you, there are 85,000 people in prison in Britain today. Guess how many of them are women? And if you read the Daily Mail, you would have thought 40,000 of them are women. But they're not. There's only 5,000 are women. And then you say, OK, of the remaining 80,000, how many do you think have killed someone? And they'll go, oh, about 35,000? Because the way crime is depicted in, in low-quality press is that we should all be fearful. And that is not the problem. The problem is that we lock up loads and loads of people. Britain locks up more people per head of population than any other European country. Are British people naughtier than French people? In that case, why are we leaving the EU? So we'll have lots of naughty people in one country. So it's to do with sentencing guidelines. And because there's no desire...
Prisoners like the idea to leave the EU, or they don't care?
They don't have a vote. Prisoners don't have the vote. They do have it when they come out. So my point is that when, it's a big problem Britain's got, but no government ever deals with it. And so when I started doing this in about 1990, I thought, the trends. The trend is that, there's a lot of talk about trying to reduce the prison population. And I thought, in 10 years' time, I won't have to do this. I won't do this. In fact, it's just gone completely the other way.
Yeah, how can you reduce population if they commit murder or horrible things?
You keep dwelling on this one stream. That's fine. We can deal with the murderers, but it's all the rest of them. How are you going to make them? It's all about making them not reoffend. Recidivism, and then a lot of imprisonment is connected to drugs, and it is many prison people connected with issues of prison reform say that if drugs were decriminalised, this whole business of dealing in drugs, if you could just buy your drugs at Boots, clean, there's a massive sort of criminal class just connected to drugs, and it just ruins people's lives. So there's an idea that if you decriminalise drugs, that it would wipe out that business.
I mean, most of the people in prison are there because of drugs?
I'm not saying most. I'm into numbers. Many. I'd say a good number, but not most. Because most, it has to be more than half. And I'm not going to say it's more than half.
And you never had personal problems?
Never. Isn't that weird? I've never ever felt threatened.
And how is the relationship between the police and the prisoners?
Many of them are there really motivated. When you say what's in my heart, what's in their heart, they really do believe they are in a situation where they could try and get the prisoners to turn their lives around. And they are very caring and nurturing, but they also have to follow the rules and make sure the guy does what he's meant to do. And yeah, I've seen some astonishingly brilliant people working in prisons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alain Elkann interviews.